Welcome to today's talk, which is Grant Writing Strategies for Community and Academic Collaborations. Just to really ground us in what the purpose of this session is, we're going to focus today on exploring how effective proposal writing sustains science with a focus on alignment, collaboration, and shared purpose. So as Dr. Ackerman said, this is part of the Communicating the Science series. It's also part of our program in public health's ongoing workforce development series. So we're covering a lot of different areas today. What we're hoping to cover today falls into these three objectives. So first, we want to understand grant proposals as a communication process reflecting alignment, not just requests for resources. We also want to talk about how to identify language choices that can reflect attention to equity, partnership, and systems awareness in your conversations and your proposal development, and to approach grant development with reflection, adaptability, and collaborative care rather than compliance or scarcity thinking. So just to level set where we are starting today, just because not everyone is familiar with what a grant proposal is, we have this definition from Northwestern, where a grant proposal is a tailored document that presents a project to a specific funder and is designed to match that funder's mission, priorities, and decision-making audience. So proposals do a lot of different things. They can be seen as a tool for communication. You can talk about how people's values, evidence, and partnership are aligned, and how they would have an impact on health disparities. You can talk about how to translate vision into structure. So covering things like rigor, relevance, relational credibility, reliability, all at the same time. And although often we think about a grant proposal as a way to ask for money, these are more than just a simple budget request. It's a narrative about why the work that you're proposing must exist and why it must exist now, and why you must be the one to do it. So looking at what a community academic partnership is, one way we can classify this is using these four different criteria within this Drahota paper. So it's characterized by one, equitable control, two, a cause that's primarily relevant to the community of interest, and three, specific aims to achieve a goal. And specific for the work we do, the work you all do, there's this fourth point, which is the involvement of community members that have knowledge of the cause as well as academic researchers. So equity, relevance to the community, goal-focused, and inclusion of community members and academic researchers in the conversation. To get there, based on what PCORI, or the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, says, is that meaningful engagement is an active partnership between researchers, patients, caregivers, clinicians, and other partners throughout the entire research process. We'll be coming back to the topic of engagement, community engagement throughout this talk, and want to just emphasize that this is an ongoing process and one that should start well before a grant proposal is written and should last well after the grant ends. So we have a very diverse audience today. We have researchers, both academic and community-based, and people who have a variety of experience across different milestones in life, people who are staff, people who are faculty, people who are leading projects, people who are just working at an agency. So we're talking at multiple levels today, talking about partnership development more broadly between academic and community-based researchers, and going through what the proposal development lifecycle is, as well as processes that are related to this. We want this to be relevant not just to you as an individual researcher, but also to the institution you represent and to whatever partnership you might be developing in the future, either if you're at a community agency with an academic, if you're at an academic institution with a community partner. We want this to be relevant for everyone. So one of the things that is always on our mind with public health and health research is that funding landscape is especially volatile right now. We should really be focusing on how we can strategically pursue grants, not focus on a scarcity mindset, and really focusing more on reflective actions instead of perfection. So We want to be adaptable, and we want to be clear about what our priorities, what our vision, what our values are in all the work we do. So just these points to underpin everything I'm going to be talking about today. There's a lot we're going to be covering in a very short time today. I teach classes in grant writing and community engagement and community academic partnerships. Trying to squeeze all of that into a single hour is very difficult, but we're going to give a high-level overview of everything, and then we'll have time for questions and answers throughout the presentation. Please post them as you can. We'll get to them at the end, and if anything comes up, just let me know if it's comments, thoughts, questions, and we'll address them at the end. So, talked about what a grant proposal is. Now we want to talk about how to frame or reframe the proposal if it's something you've already done and want to take another approach or another partnering approach to taking action in seeking a grant. So, those of us who have written proposals, who've reviewed proposals, who have been in classes where we talk about grant proposals, know most of the proposals contain common sections. These are things like a needs statement where you say what the need is you're addressing, specific aims or goals, a list of ways that you're going to address that need through research or practice, the methods or approach about how you're actually going to do the project, your partnership plan, so how you're going to partner with the people who are involved in the project. So institutional partnership, but also partnership with other investigators within your institution. How are you going to evaluate the project and see what its impact is on the communities you're interested in? And then obviously the budget narrative to say how you're going to be spending the money and what the money will be used to address the needs, to get through the aims, and to eventually show you have an impact on the health condition. Each of these sections has their own power dynamics and values. So this refers to more than just our personal values. This can also be what our academic values are, our cultural values are. And I'm sure as many of you have read through various proposals, you can see how this can or cannot come out. And what I really want to stress is how the language you use in proposals can really demonstrate where our actions, our values fall in the continuum from extractive to transformative. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll keep coming back to this community engagement spectrum, and we'll talk about how to move your partnership further to transformative and away from extractive. So some examples of extractive language are communities will be recruited, participants will comply with, things where there's no power in the community, no power in the people you're working with. I want to encourage you to think about how to reframe this using more collaborative language. So instead of communities will be recruited, use things like develop with community partners to identify shared priorities. Instead of saying participants will comply with, say co-design protocols will ensure mutual accountability and benefit. You can see the difference between these two where the one on the left, we're doing things on or to the community, the one on the right, we're doing things with the community, and that's what we want to be working towards in our proposals. Really, you want to be careful about what each statement you write says about the nature of your partnership, how rigorous your partnership is, what credibility there is, how much trust there is in that relationship. So sentences, paragraphs, grant proposals in a whole, these show how shared power exists, what the respect is for community expertise, and these are a good way to show how to co-create a proposal and what your credibility is in doing community engaged research with and not on the community. And as you get more accustomed to doing work and writing this way, it'll reflect how you've developed a relationship, what the rigor is in your relationship development process, and ultimately build trust with not just a single community agency, but with community agencies in general, because we know people love to talk about what works, what doesn't work, who's a good partner, who's a bad partner. We want to aim towards everyone being a good partner in collaborative grant development. So just a few examples from some of the work that I've done to showcase how we've done this. Uh, One of these is from ARC. Many of you may be familiar with the Alliance for Research with Chicagoland Communities, or ARC. It's a great resource that Northwestern has, and I know many people have been funded and supported by their work. If you aren't familiar with them, I highly encourage you to take a look at their website. There's a lot of great resources there for everything from developing a memorandum of understanding to collaboratively publishing with a community partner. I've been lucky to get funding from ARC to do some work with a variety of community partners. One that I'm going to highlight here is our partnership with Task Force Prevention and Community Services. We established a co-leadership structure at the beginning within our Pilot C grant. This is how we wrote it in the project. The Task Force Community Academic Partnership is co-led by Dr. Balthazar at Task Force and Dr. Phillips at Edit. The primary goals include establishing a formal partnership for community-engaged research, identifying shared priorities, and realizing them through co-owned study activities. So we start off by saying this is co-led. There's no differentiation in power. Everything is really focused on partnering and doing things together, and that really comes out in these two sentences. Another example is from our work with Lighthouse Foundation in a submission we made to Arnold Ventures. What we wrote was, the study's leadership will operate under a shared governance model that centers equity in both decision-making and resource distribution. Lighthouse will lead implementation, refinement, and stakeholder engagement, while the EDIT program will co-lead data integration and analysis. Fiscal responsibilities and dissemination opportunities will be shared. So most partnerships, everyone's not doing everything. So you can imagine certain partnerships, academics doing one thing, the community is doing another thing. It's great to show that you have a shared governance model, you are focused on equity and spreading out the decision-making process, but also highlighting what each partner is doing so that it's clear that you're bringing unique strengths, but you're also dedicated to working together. And the final one was our work with the Chicago Methamphetamine Task Force. We submitted a proposal for an NIH R61, R33 application to expand the work that was being done. And we wanted to highlight what our shared governance model was from the very beginning. And we were using this sentence to discuss that under the collective leadership of the CMTF, functioning with the authority of a board of directors and the guidance of a community advisory board, Chicago Black Gay Men's Caucus, Task Force, and EDIT will coordinate application execution to meet CMTF calls to action, ensuring EPI to care, which was the name of the proposal, aligns with CMTF priorities for rapid translation and closing the research to practice gap. So clearly outlining how people are working together, what the role of the body is in making decisions, and how the community is engaged. Another thing we intentionally did was this was a multiple PI proposal. It was led by me, the executive director of Chicago Black Men's Caucus, and the executive director of Task Force. And we split the budget 3 ways to make sure things are equitable. So thinking about ways you can actually show how you're going to dedicate time and energy to the community through things like shared funding is one thing you can think about. So preparing a proposal, thinking about how to write is great, but we all know there's a variety of different funders who are looking to support people's research. Each sponsor type values different forms of credibility. Many of us who are based here at Northwestern are primarily familiar with federal or NIH funding. Many people who are in the community are more familiar with philanthropy or foundation funding. And then there's another smaller bucket, which is community or collaborative funding, which can be things like community trusts. Success in your partnership usually means focus on how you can translate the rigor and equity that you value into how you write about it for different funding languages. The content of a grant proposal for NIH is going to be very different from one for a foundation. As we started off talking about how the funding landscape is volatile right now, there's a lot of challenges with federal funding at the moment, and philanthropic and community-based grant makers are now becoming more appealing to academics and are helping to complement some shrinking funding streams that we were typically used to. So there's more of a focus now on diversifying our portfolios, and we want to make sure we cover that as well today. Really being clear about what we're doing, why we're doing it across the board is also going to be helpful. So having authenticity and clarity about why we're pursuing a specific funding announcement, who we're working with, and what we hope to get out of the partnership are going to be really key to making sure that your proposal is tailored for the right sponsor. So these are some priorities for different funders. So NIH or federal funders, they really look for rigor, alignment with national priorities, and really structured compliance. So anyone who's written an NIH grant knows how focused they are on page limits and fonts and spacing and everything. That is typical of federal funding. Philanthropy or foundation, these are a lot more focused on a narrative. So is there coherence in the narrative that you're proposing? They are really interested in storytelling. So what impact is this going to have? How is it going to influence the community? And most foundations really have this dedication to equity and innovation, which is not always present or prioritized in some of the federal funding announcements. And then we have community or collaborative, which is anything else. And these are really co-designed projects. They focus primarily on reciprocity, so equal leadership, equal attention to uh, anything that happens within the grant proposal. And there's also usually a key focus on capacity building and technical assistance. So each of these takes a different skill set. So think about what different approaches are that you might want to take to meet funder priorities while centering the community academic partnership. It can be very easy to stray away from building a partnership to make sure that you are competitive for one of these over the other, but trying to make sure you always have the partnership's best interest in mind as you're moving forward is going to make sure that you maintain a good partnership and you have a good foundation for future funding announcements. So specifically, align evidence goals with community priorities, not at their expense, and make sure you're able to translate what impact your partnership will have to the funder while also not detracting from the authenticity, not overstating things, not decentering the community. Think about ways to do this in a way that will still be appealing to the funder. So some considerations, as I've alluded to a bit, is figuring out who should be the lead on a proposal is a crucial and difficult conversation often. Best way I've come to this is to really leverage funder logics to open space to introduce your partnership. Different partners have different priorities, so foundation grant makers such as Robert Wood Johnson or Spencer value community-rooted leadership and narrative authenticity. Most times you'll see these proposals are being led by a community partner. Governmental grant makers such as NIH or CDC associate institutional infrastructure with credibility and compliance. These are often academic-led. So thinking through who has a better chance of getting this, if you have an equitable partnership and you are open with your partner, this shouldn't really matter too much who is leading it as long as you know who has a better chance of getting this. Another consideration is always indirect rates. Most academic institutions have very high indirect rates and administrative fees, so there might be some considerations on who is a better primary submitter for this, just to make sure that everyone has an equal share of the projected award. Other considerations to keep in mind is, have any of the partners received money from the funder? Most funders, if you've received money from them in the past, you're going to be more likely to get it from them in the future, so strategically thinking about that and thinking through which partners are best equipped to manage the grant submission. Some grants have really complicated administrative requirements. Some require you to do a lot of reporting and thinking through, does the academic partner have a better infrastructure for that? or is a community partner going to be set up for success based on what they already are doing? So going from now, how do we find and decide on what to submit to, how to articulate what we're doing, and how to tailor something for a specific agency? Now, the really complicated but most important part of what happens is the partnering. Partnerships exist on a spectrum. As I mentioned earlier, they go from extractive to transformative. There's also transactional and relational in there. There's a lot of ways you can start thinking about what a good partnership is. And even if you have a good partnership, there's always room for improvement. So thinking about how you can move further to the right in this spectrum. Ways to get started are before you even write a grant proposal, I recommend you get to know a community partner, you build a relationship. That's hard in most situations because a lot of times funding drives our partnering and our research. But the earlier you can get started to build a relationship, the better. Once you do have a vision for what your proposal is or what your partnership should lead to, map roles, decision rights, and benefits early on. You don't want there to be uh, any opaqueness. You don't want there to be any questions about who's in charge of what, who has access to what. You want to build time for relationship maintenance into budgets and timelines. As strong as your partnership is, there are a lot of things that can derail it. If you don't have time for regular meetings, time to travel to each other's sites, times to go into the community, you might end up damaging the relationship. So make sure you have time dedicated to maintaining the relationship. Also making sure that you're able to position everyone's expertise as co-equal contributions. A lot of times as academics, we're told to prioritize things like where do we get our degree, what degrees do we have, how much money we've brought in, how many publications do we have. That's fine, but there's other things that are valuable as well. And making sure that you're able to highlight how lived experience, how community practice is just as important in the work that's being done. And do that on a continuous basis, not just as a performative metric. Authentic partnerships produce better science and sustain well-being. I think most of you are here because you believe that, but it's always good to restate that because it's easy to forget when we are so focused on trying to do things that are going to improve our career, improve our communities, really make a difference. And maintaining a partnership is often not the primary focus of the work we're doing. This is my favorite community engagement spectrum that I use in my classes and other lectures I do about how we think about engaging with the community. And we can see everything from completely ignoring the community on the left all the way to deferring to. And I tell my students and other people I work with that it's not always best to start all the way at community ownership because you may be setting your community partner up to fail. But the more we can work towards the right in partnering and build capacity for agencies to the point where we can collaborate or defer to them on research proposals, we're still making a difference. So keeping that in mind as we're doing work is going to be important. We want to get away from marginalization and placation and get closer to delegated power and community ownership in our partnerships. So we can think about the research project lifecycle in a number of phases. And at each phase, we want to think about uh, different questions. Who has deciding power? Who is going to benefit? Who is going to be responsible for sustaining the work across each of these steps? And the primary steps we can think of are initiation and conceptualization. So who comes up with the idea? Who writes out what we're planning to do? Planning and design, who's responsible for drafting the recruitment plan and who's responsible for designing the intervention, conducting and collecting. So who is recruiting participants, who is collecting the data, who's analyzing the data, dissemination and utilization, how are we sharing the data, how are we making sure the community can use the data, and then the another thing that gets forgotten a lot is post-project. You wrap up a project, you shouldn't just end the project because the funding has ended, but figure out ways to sustain the project and to leverage the work that you've already done in building a partnership to continue doing good work. So this you can think then also translates into the proposal development. We focus a lot on partnership building within a project, but as I said, you want this to start before the project. Ideally before you're even developing a proposal, but if you're in the proposal development process, these are the steps you should be focused on, thinking about how can we meaningfully incorporate partnership and make sure everyone is reflected in each of these steps. So these include relationship and readiness building, alignment and concept development, co-design infrastructure planning, proposal development and integration, review, refinement and submission, reflection, feedback, and transitions. So I like to always recommend people reflect on where they're at with a specific partnership because I find that that is helpful to figure out what your baseline is. So we want to also think about this as a trajectory towards equity, as I mentioned, moving further to the right on that spectrum, that continuum is going to be a goal, but it's not something we should do overnight. And part of the way to get there is reflecting on how we grow our practice and how we move towards equity. So, want all of you to think about how you would rank one of your partnerships. It could be a current or recent one, and want you to think about how you would rate each of these statements from 1 being low to 5 being high. I'm not going to ask you to put it in the Q&A or anything, just something to reflect on as we're talking today. But first prompt, partners co-designed all key decisions. Second prompt, information flowed bidirectionally and transparently. Third prompt, community priorities shaped research questions. Fourth prompt, resources, opportunities, and credit were shared equitably. And fifth prompt, we continue to maintain our partnership post-submission. Obviously, having a 5 on all of these is going to be ideal, but this is helpful to see where there's areas for improvement, where you're doing well, and really thinking about how you would self-rank your own partnership building practice. So when you're co-designing a proposal, it doesn't happen overnight and it doesn't happen completely together. You can imagine parts of this happen as a group, parts of it happen alone, and really that is up to the people who are involved, what your proposal development looks like. But these are the 5 main steps you can think of in a proposal development process. And each of these steps are meant to ensure that community voice, academic voice, and the partnership are at the center in the development. So exploration is where you're co-identifying and defining what the project is, what your priorities are, and what we're hoping to do in the work. So thinking about who our funder is, what our research question is, how much money we're asking for it, what our timeline is, all of those kinds of things start very early on. Then the concept, so aligning our goals and our evidence to the partnership logic. So what are we hoping to do? How is this built on what our partnership is designed to do? And how are we going to be collecting the evidence to do this work? Then drafting, this tends to be the hardest part is where you're usually co-writing the research proposal. And some people like sending out specific sections for people to write. Some people like shared documents. Can be whatever you want to do, but really having a way so that everyone can see the full proposal, not just parts of it, are great to ensure that you have a co-design process in mind. Also making sure that all the sections have shared language. A lot of times we get into the habit of using jargon and technical terminology, and I want to make sure that everyone understands what we're writing. When we get to the submission process, we go through, look through at everything to make sure everyone's equitably credited, everything's accessible for people of diverse backgrounds, and that we're speaking in one voice. That it's not clear what the community is doing was written by the community, what the academic's doing, written by the academic. And then, as I said, a lot of times we forget about debriefing after something happens. We submit a proposal, we're happy to be rid of it. A lot of times we just move on to something else and we don't regroup and talk about how the process went. But to build a good partnership, this is really a key point to check in to see, did this work well? Are we going to continue to use this model? Should we do something different? Or did this show that we shouldn't really be partnering in the future because we had misalignment in our ideas? So, thinking about all these steps and thinking about how we can do a better job at centering the partnership in the proposal development, starting with relationship and readiness building. So, shifting from outreach to co-orientation. If you have a partner in mind, this is helpful. You don't want to start by saying, I'm doing research on a particular community. I'm going to do a Google search and see who's doing work on that community, and then reach out to them and hope that a cold email is good enough to get a partner. You want to have a way of building a relationship ahead of time so that it's clear that you and your partner have the same orientation. Having shared values, having shared priorities, and knowing what you're both working towards are going to be key to success in developing a proposal. You want to make sure that you're not misaligned because if you have different values, if you're working towards different things, as good as your grant proposal is, it's going to be at risk for falling apart because of this potential conflict. Another thing you can do is co-create readiness checklists. We think about a lot of times in the academy about how we do technical assistance, how we do capacity building for communities to make sure that they are ready to engage in research. But a lot less often we do readiness checklists for academics to see how ready we are to do community-led, community-engaged relationship building and partnering. So developing these checklists together to see not just our own personal readiness, but those of our team and our institution to do this work is great at seeing where there are difficulties in the process, where there are things we might need to address in advance. For instance, it can be difficult at an academic institution to uh, develop subcontracts with community partners. Knowing that ahead of time, you can work out a process. You can talk to people who are roadblocks and make sure you're able to overcome those before you get to the point where it causes a problem. Then getting to the alignment and concept development, here you can use dual agenda framing. So you want to talk about scientific outcomes because that's what's valued in a grant proposal, but you also want to talk about community impacts and community outcomes. And you want to make sure that these are talked about in equal terms. We may think scientific rigor is more important, or we may think lived experience is more important, but doing something so we can highlight the equal contribution of both of these and framing the agenda is going to be critical. We also want to make sure that when we're doing this, there's equity in this. A lot of times we have this assumption that one partner is better equipped to develop the aims than another, and they take the lead. But figuring out ways that we can co-develop the specific aims and how we can co-write them and address them as we're moving through the process is really going to be helpful to ensure that there's equity from the beginning, even before we start writing. Then moving to the co-design and infrastructure planning. Here, we want to make sure we have this reciprocal governance, shared governance model. Going into a project without shared decision-making is going to set up for a really difficult situation. So starting early about what decision-making looks like, how you're rotating leads or co-chairs, who's taking the lead on what, all of these are going to be critical for making sure there's this shared governance throughout the partnership. and budgeting for all labor. So making sure that community partners, community agencies are funded adequately for their time, making sure that we're not underpaying, that we're not underutilizing their expertise, and making sure that we're not overlooking specific activities. Things like translation, reaching out to partners to talk about recruitment process. All of these take time. All of these should be funded. So making sure that that's all built in ahead of time will go a long way to making sure that the community side of your partnership is well aware that you are invested in their work. And then proposal development and integration. I mentioned this a little earlier, but whatever co-writing looks like to you and your partnership, making sure you're able to engage in that and that all partners agree that this is the best approach. And making sure if people are less familiar with terminology, that you're able to do some capacity building activities to make sure that if they're not familiar with what a biosketch is, if they're not familiar with what a conceptual model is, things like that that we expect to see in NIH proposals. These are things that we can easily teach our community partners what they mean if they're not familiar with them, to make sure that they're able to equally contribute to the proposal development. And then making sure everything is clearly documented. Who is leading the project? Is there a shared leadership model? I think places like the NIH have a good format for a multiple PI model where at least two people are co-leading the project and outlining what their roles and responsibilities are, making sure there's something set up there at the beginning about what the leadership looks like, how much money is going to each partner, and making sure that's in writing and agreed to by everyone. Then you want to work through the process. You don't want to stop there. You want to make sure that you're working together to review, refine, and submit. So looking through the project, making sure that everyone agrees that it looks good, not just saying we're out of time, I'm going to submit this, making sure that people have a voice or can say, I trust you, you can submit this without me. And then figure out how you're going to communicate with the funder if they reach out for more information. A lot of times, funders will reach out either through a just-in-time request or will have specific questions about your proposal that they'd like for you to clarify, and think through how you can address these concerns together rather than just as an academic or just as a community partner. After the grant goes in, thinking about what you learned from this, likely you encountered some tensions during the process, especially with a new partner. It's good to discuss why that happened, how you can prevent that in the future, and think about how you can build and strengthen your trust in the relationship as you're moving forward after this grant submission. And then if you're funded, you want to use this time to think through how we're going to work together to do this project we wrote. If it's not funded, you want to revisit how are we going to apply for other funding? Are we going to resubmit this? Are we going to look for other resources? Or is this just not a relationship we want to continue to pursue? And that's another thing that doesn't always get discussed is that not all relationships are going to be with you for your lifetime. Sometimes there's a natural stopping point where the partnership's no longer beneficial to one or both parties, and it's perfectly fine to end the partnership. And anyone who has done community engaged work will tell you that this is just a natural part of partnering and developing relationships. I have a lot of history with this, which is part of why I'm giving this talk today, but we have a growing family of partners who we've worked with, and they all come with challenges, they all come with positives, and really the focus just needs to be transparency, shared governance, and ongoing conversation. So having one or two partners can be challenging, having even more can be more challenging. Thinking through how you have a shared vision, values, and approach to things like health equity and community empowerment are really critical to make sure that this relationship continues. So just wrapping this piece up with the do's and don'ts for co-designing, you want to make sure you start early. So even before you write a grant proposal, you want to start by building shared context and co-developing templates. You want to center community-defined outcomes and reciprocity throughout the development process. Not just do it at the beginning, not just do it at the end, but throughout the entire proposal development process. Use transparent living documents, so whether that's SharePoint or Google Drive or something, whatever you need to make sure that you're able to share documents, and then have accountability throughout the process, not just at the end, not just after the grant gets funded, but make sure it's clear who is responsible for what, how much money is going to whom, and who's leading the project. Things you want to avoid is only engaging your partner after you've already decided on your idea, using funder language without thinking about how that could impact or be understood by other partners, centralizing authority in a single institution, so decentering this partnership by saying, oh, it's too difficult for a community partner to administer this grant, so we're going to just do everything at our academic institution. And skipping the debriefs or reflection after the submission. So making sure you talk with your partners over time, making sure you're able to personally reflect on how it went, but also reflect in collaboration with the partners to see, did this work? Did this not work? What can we do differently in the future? And really, we know that not all of your attempts are going to be great. Sometimes things go wrong, sometimes partnerships break up, sometimes there's lapse in communication. Whatever it is, attempting is great, and doing this work and building the habit of doing this work is really what we're aiming to. So making this a routine in your community academic partnership development process is only going to serve to build trust and longevity in the work you do. So things to think through as you're working on developing a partnership and as you're thinking about developing a partnership that's based on proposal development.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Gregory. It's our pleasure to have you today, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. As Gregory said, if you have further questions or comments about the presentation or interest in other topics that are similar, please let us know. You can contact us directly through our IFAM link, and you can contact Dr. Phillips directly.